السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. This practical session we will describe the cerebellar anatomy or the anatomy of the cerebellum. So as you know, the cerebellum is composed of two cerebellar hemispheres which are separated by a midline structure called the vermis. This is the anterior notch of the cerebellum, which is lodged by the brainstem, and this is the posterior notch of the cerebellum, which is lodged by a fold of dura called falx cerebelli between the two cerebellar hemispheres. This is this view of the superior view of the cerebellum, in which we are looking to the superior surface of the cerebellum. The cerebellum is also has a midline structure called vermis of the cerebellum. So this should be the superior vermis of the cerebellum, and the rest of the cerebellum is divided into folia. These folds of the cerebellar tissue are called folia of the cerebellum. And this is the cerebellar hemisphere. This is the right cerebellar hemisphere, and on the other side, the left cerebellar hemisphere. We should also identify this fissure, which is obviously seen on the superior surface of the cerebellum. This fissure is called primary fissure. The primary fissure separates between the anterior lobe of the cerebellum and the posterior lobe of the cerebellum. So this part represents the anterior lobe of the cerebellum, which is representing around 1/3 of the cerebellum on the superior surface, and this whole part is the inferior or is a posterior lobe of the cerebellum. This is the posterior lobe of the cerebellum, which represents around 2/3 or the posterior 2/3 of the cerebellar tissue. Also, the part of vermis is included in the posterior lobe, and the anterior part of the vermis is included in the anterior lobe of the cerebellum. We should also be able to identify that fissure, which is the horizontal fissure. The horizontal fissure begins near to the anterior end of the cerebellum, or the anterior notch of the cerebellum, and it divides the cerebellum into upper and lower part, and ends again into the anterior notch of the cerebellum. So this is the horizontal fissure. So the anterior notch, this is the anterior notch, and this is the posterior notch, and this is the primary fissure of the cerebellum. This is the horizontal fissure of the cerebellum. This is the superior vermis, which is divided into two parts, part with the anterior lobe in front of the primary fissure, and part with the posterior lobe behind the primary fissure. And these are all details you should know about the superior surface or the superior view of the cerebellum. If you go to the inferior view of the cerebellum, this is the inferior view of the cerebellum. We have also anterior and posterior notch. So this is the posterior notch. On the inferior surface of the cerebellum, you should be able to identify another lobe, or the third lobe of the cerebellum, that's called folliculo-nodular lobe. This folliculo-nodular lobe is the part of the cerebellum that is responsible for balance. Folliculo-nodular lobe is composed of central part, which is this part. This is a part of inferior vermis. It's called nodule. And these wings of the cerebellar hemispheres are called folliculus. So the whole thing is called folliculonodular loop. This is the rest of the inferior vermis of the cerebellum, which will be included in the posterior loop. So this whole part is the posterior lobe of the cerebellum, represented on the inferior view. Posterior lobe. And this is the inferior view of the cerebellum. The posterolateral fissure is separating between the whole folliculonodular loop from the rest of the cerebellar hemispheres. This fissure is called posterolateral fissure. Obviously, it is only seen on the inferior view of the cerebellum because we couldn't identify this structure in the previous drawing of the superior surface. This part of the cerebellum representing the superior or the anterior lobe of the cerebellum, with the part of the vermis that is on the superior surface, which is the anterior, which is the superior vermis. So this the anterior lobe of the cerebellum. In this part, near to the anterior lobe, we should identify the three structures which are joining between the cerebellum and the brain stem. These structures are called cerebellar peduncles. So the cut edges of the cerebellar peduncles appear on the inferior surface of the cerebellum as three cut edges like this. The largest part is the lateral part, which represent the the middle cerebellar peduncle between the pons and the cerebellum. And the small upper part is this part, which represent the superior cerebellar peduncle between the midbrain and the cerebellum. And the lowermost part is this part, which represents the inferior cerebellar peduncle, the inferior cerebellar peduncle between the medulla oblongata and the cerebellum. So these cut edges are representing the peduncles of the cerebellum, the superior, the middle, the inferior cerebellar peduncles between the brain stem and the cerebellum, and of course they are separated from the cerebellum by the cavity of the fourth ventricle. Also, in the inferior surface, we should identify an important structure from the cerebellar tissue, which lies near to the inferior vermis. This part of the cerebellum is called cerebellar tonsils. The cerebellar tonsils are the structures of the cerebellum that lies near to the medulla oblongata in the foramen magnum. Cerebellar tonsils. And in case of increased intracranial pressure, these tonsils are herniated through the foramen magnum around the medulla and makes pressure on the vital centers in the medulla oblongata near to in the opening of the foramen magnum, and this condition occurs in cases of increased intracranial pressure. And that's all about the inferior view of the cerebellum. So you should identify the anterior loop and the posterior loop, and this is the posterior notch, so you know which is front and which is back of the cerebellum. Most importantly, the follicular-nodular loop, which is separated from the rest of the cerebellum by this fissure, posterolateral fissure, and this is the inferior vermis. This part is the inferior vermis of the cerebellum. The most anterior part is the nodule, which is included in the folliculo-nodular loop, and these are the cerebellar tonsils on both sides, and this is the cut edge of the middle cerebellar peduncle, which is the lateral largest mass. Below the middle we have the inferior cerebellar peduncle, and above the middle cerebellar peduncle we have the superior cerebellar peduncle. Thank you very much.
Welcome to this practical session in which we will describe the anatomy of the cerebellum and also the sagittal section of the brain and the communication between the ventricles inside the brain and outside the brain and the CSF circulation. First of all, we will describe the anatomy of the cerebellum and the location of the cerebellum in relation to the cerebrum. So this is the cerebrum. These are the two cerebrum hemispheres, and this is the cerebellum, which is composed of two cerebellar hemispheres as well. The cerebellum, which is the organ of the hindbrain, or the second brain, as some books describe the cerebellum, has a function of balance, planning, and coordination of different movements. The cerebellum is separated from the cerebrum here by this fissure, which is lodged by the tentorium cerebelli. So the cerebellum is completely covered from the superior surface by the tentorium cerebelli, which is a fold of the dura separating the cerebellum from the cerebrum. Cerebellum is divided into two cerebellar hemispheres, which are connected through this structure. This structure is called the vermis. So as you can see, this is the right cerebellar hemisphere, this is the left cerebellar hemisphere, and this is the midline vermis. The cerebellum is composed of these folds, as you can see here. These folds are called folia. This is the cerebrum, and this is the cerebellum down here, and here is the place of the tentorium cerebelli. And these are the folia of the cerebellum on both sides. So if we remove the cerebellum outside from the brain, this is the cerebellum. The cerebellum has two notches, the anterior notch and the posterior notch. This notch is called the Follicular. So this is the anterior notch, and this is the posterior notch. The anterior notch here is lodged by the brain stem, midbrain, bones, medulla oblongata. They are separated from the anterior notch is separated from the cerebellum by a cavity. This cavity here is called the fourth ventricle. The posterior notch here is lodged by a dural fold called falx cerebelli. So here the midbrain, and here is the falx cerebelli. This is the right cerebellar hemisphere, and this is the left cerebellar hemisphere, and this is the superior vermis on the superior surface of the cerebellum. Here, this is the inferior vermis, which is continuous with the superior vermis on the inferior surface of the cerebellum. Cerebellum has two sides of the vermis, as we said, the superior vermis and inferior vermis. This vermis is subdivided into many parts, and Each part of this vermis is continuous with a substance of the cerebellum on the right and on the left side, making the cerebellum divided into lobules. The cerebellum has 3 lobes. This is the anterior lobe, and this is the posterior lobe, and here on the inferior surface a small structure which is called folliculo-nodular lobe. So the anterior lobe, posterior lobe, and folliculo-nodular lobe. Cerebellum also has primary fissure, which is this fissure here. The primary fissure is lying on the superior surface of the cerebellum. Divides the superior surface into anterior 1/3 and posterior 2/3. This fissure is called the primary fissure. Also, the cerebellum has horizontal or transverse fissure, which is this fissure. This fissure begins near to the anterior notch and curves around the cerebellum to end again to the anterior notch. This fissure divides the cerebellum into superior and inferior parts. So this is the superior part and this is the inferior part. So we have primary fissure, horizontal fissure, and again there is a fissure on the inferior surface of the cerebellum called posterolateral fissure. The posterolateral fissure separates the folliculo-nodular lobe, which is this part, and the rest of the cerebellum. So this is called posterolateral fissure. So we have 3 fissures: primary fissure, horizontal fissure or transverse fissure, and posterolateral fissure. We have 3 lobes of the cerebellum. The anterior lobe, which lies in front of the primary fissure. This lobe includes part of the cerebellum, part of the vermis in the midline, and part of the cerebellum on the right and the left cerebellar hemisphere. This is called anterior lobe of the cerebellum. Behind the primary fissure, the part of the cerebellum behind the primary fissure on the superior surface and curves to include all the posterior, all the inferior surface of the cerebellum. This part of cerebellum is called posterior lobe of the cerebellum. So the part of the cerebellum behind the primary fissure on the superior surface and most of the inferior surface, this is called posterior lobe of the cerebellum. The last lobe is the folliculo-nodular lobe, as we mentioned before. This is the folliculo-nodular lobe. This is the cerebellum. This is the right cerebellar hemisphere. This is the left cerebellar hemisphere. This is the superior vermis, and this is the inferior vermis, which is obvious here between the 2 cerebellar hemispheres. This is the anterior notch, which is lodged by the brain stem, midbrain, bones, medulla, and they are separated from the brain stem by a cavity called the cavity of the 4th ventricle. This is the posterior notch of the cerebellum, which is called Follicular, and this Follicula is lodged by a dural fold called Falx cerebelli. The superior surface is completely separated from the cerebrum above by a dural fold called Tentorium cerebelli, as we mentioned before. We have 3 fissures of the cerebellum and 3 lobes of the cerebellum. The first fissure is this one, which is the primary fissure. The primary fissure is lying on the superior surface of the cerebellum, separating between the anterior and posterior lobe. So this is the anterior lobe of the cerebellum in front of the primary fissure, and this is the posterior lobe of the cerebellum behind the primary fissure on the superior surface, and also
it makes most of the inferior surface of the cerebellum. The second fissure is this one, which is the horizontal fissure. The horizontal fissure begins near to the anterior notch of the cerebellum and divides the cerebellum into superior and inferior parts, and then ends again in the anterior notch of the cerebellum. The third one, or the third fissure, is seen on the inferior surface of the cerebellum, which is this one, posterolateral fissure. The posterolateral fissure separates between this small loop here, which is called folliculonodular loop. It's formed by a part of a vermis called nodule, and this part of the cerebellum, which is called folliculus and parafolliculus. So the posterolateral fissure separates between the folliculonodular loop from the rest of the cerebellum. So this is the anterior loop of the cerebellum, this part, and this is the posterior loop, and this is the folliculonodular loop. This is the cut edge of the cerebellar peduncles. What are these cerebellar peduncles? Cerebellar peduncles are the connections between the cerebellum and the brainstem structure, which are the midbrain above, pons in the middle, and the medulla oblongata here. So the superior cerebellar peduncle, which is this structure on both sides, this tract connects between the cerebellum and the midbrain. And this is the cut surface of the middle cerebellar peduncle, which connects between the pons and the cerebellum. And this is the cut edge of the inferior cerebellar peduncles on both sides, which connects between the cerebellum and the medulla oblongata, making a cavity between the cerebellum in the posterior and the brainstem, which is specifically the back of pons and back of upper medulla. This cavity is called the fourth ventricle, which communicates above with the cavity of the third ventricle and below with the spinal canal of the inside the spinal cord.